So in the Buddha's teaching, we have this idea of the inversion of perception, that people wrongly perceive things as that which is impermanent as permanent, that which is unsatisfactory as being a source of happiness, that which is non-self to be an impersonal and uncontrollable, ultimately to be self and controllable. So the whole purpose of the Buddha's meditation is to firstly deal with the conscious manifestations of that wanting life to be different and learning to not to act in that way, but then to look closely at life before you go and try and manipulate it.
Yes.
In order to correct the misperceptions.
Yes, and I find also that people will then overanalyze what's going on or be very judgmental, which just compounds the whole thing. And just as you're saying, instead of just letting that all go, because it is going to go.
Yeah.
You know, I remember one of my children calling downstairs saying, I can't get off to sleep. And I said to her, if you're still asleep, if you're still awake in the morning, I'll put 10p in your piggy bank. It's just the idea that something's going to last. It's only a couple plus. It's just this idea that something's going to be permanent and I can't deal with it.
Yes.
It's tough to go through that. It's hard. It's suffering.
It is. It is suffering.
It's exactly what it is.
It is suffering.
Yes.
But this is the thing that people find so difficult, that actually that suffering could be perfect. That's such a difficult thing to put across, that actually, despite the fact that it's so unsatisfactory and won't conform to your expectations, it is yet perfect. And that even the harrowing things that people go through, and we see on the news the terrible things that people go through, those are all the result of past endeavours and past manipulations and past controls, and all the terrible things that people are doing now are going to result in similar terrible scenarios unfolding in the future, because it's all based on not understanding the way life works. So they're just making mistakes. But it's perfect because it's through making the mistakes that we learn.
Yes, yes, yes.
But that's such a difficult thing to... The implication of that and the profundity of that is so difficult to put across to people, that the suffering has to be there, because it's through the suffering that you start to inquire, and you start to question, and you start to look for answers in other directions.
Yes, because do you think that sometimes people find themselves suffering and they see that as the end of a situation? So the learning that comes later, which is, the plus side of all the suffering and that you're saying, like, but I think sometimes see like a beginning, middle and end of things, and they just see that it ends in suffering. They don't actually extend that the end of it all might be the silver lining in the cloud, and that when you've sat down and looked at that and mulled it over and done your wise reflection or whatever, you see that actually that was a lesson worth learning, and there's never an end.
It's the question that nobody can adequately answer, is that why do some people reflect wisely on the nature of suffering, and therefore it lead to the possibility of the cessation of suffering, and why do other people just suffer endlessly, never seem to learn the lessons, and then just carry on suffering? I mean, if you take the Buddha's teaching, if you don't take the Four Noble Truths as a complete teaching, if you just focus on the first and second Noble Truths, yes, I can see that life would be it wouldn't be worth living. But the point is, the third Noble Truth is that there is indeed a cessation to suffering, and there is a path that you can take. There is something that you can do yourself in order to realise the true nature of life for yourself and be free of suffering. So you have to take those Four Noble Truths together. You can't. And what some people do is they just focus on
Yes.
They can't get past the second one. They're lucky if they get past the first one before they,
Well,
before they want to argue. And
that is true. I mean, there's lots of people that you say, well, it's all suffering, and they feel that, well, I'm not suffering. If I was starving in Africa, I might be suffering, but they don't really see the suffering that's going on. And I remember when I was going through this path, and I'm sure you'll remember, it was just, of the 3 marks, the suffering was the one, not my suffering, but everybody else's, and that they just couldn't see it. And that's such a starting point, to just admit, yes, it is actually all suffering, but somehow I think people see it as some sort of diminishment of themselves if they have to admit that, yes, I suffer.
the whole path is a diminishment of that sense of myself.
So well, there's a starting point then, to just admit that even the nicest time you have comes to an end, and therefore
it is inherently unsatisfactory.
Yes.
It's not to say it wasn't a happy time.
Of course not.
Or a pleasant experience.
We all have that, but
people are aware of suffering, but they don't consciously reflect in the way that's going to lead them in the right direction to a lessening in their suffering. But people are always reacting to their suffering, and to turn away from something volitionally, you must have seen it in the first place.
That's true.
So it is actually really, really. That's the thing. It's so close.
Yes, so
it's so close to people realising in a way.
Yes. So it's the ignoring, rather than just not seeing it at all.
Yes, but that ignoring is a deliberate movement,
and it's a choice.
Away. Yes,
and people don't believe that they're actually choosing.
Well, there's the whole question that I got into in a previous video with Becky about the whole nature of choice. Which got some reactions, because that choice, in inverted commas, is so deeply conditioned. And the whole question is, well, what is it that makes somebody choose differently? If it's so deeply conditioned, but there must be that freedom to be able to choose differently. But actually, that's based on life experience, plus that wise reflection going in, to eventually going, oh, there must be. I certainly know in my own case that I only contemplated the idea that the answer to the problem of suffering might be outside of anything I could drum up using my own mind, when I'd literally got to the end of my tether, where I'd literally taken thinking and my own volitional behaviour to such a point of sort of utter failure, and realised that I'd gone all this way and hadn't actually gone anywhere, essentially, and that I was still suffering. This deep ancient wound came out of that. It's this really deep sense of just absolutely being at the end of my tether and having nowhere else to go, and finally recognising that actually maybe the problem was me, or not so much me, but actually the problem was that thinking could not produce the end of suffering.